So I think from the Russian perspective, nothing new is now added to the bucket. And so like no new perspective. Moscow doesn't see any revelation in what Prime Minister Modi said. However, what you say, like I think this is a very elegant way to stress your national interest.
This is StratNewsGlobal. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Today on The Gist, we are looking at the Prime Minister's visits to Poland and Ukraine from a Russian perspective. And our guest from Moscow is Dr. Julia Melnikova. She's a program manager with the Russian International Affairs Council. Glad to welcome from Moscow for the first time on our platform, Dr. Julia Melnikova. Thanks so much for giving us time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure is ours, Dr. Melnikova. If I can just get your perspective, a Russian perspective, on the Prime Minister's visit to Ukraine, the statements that we've all seen from both Prime Minister Modi, the Indian side, and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Okay, yes. So thank you for asking. I think this is the question that has been bothering many people while the visit was still in the wings, while it has been prepared, and afterwards and during the visit. And I think that not many people anticipated the joint statement to be issued. So I think that many people expected the visit to be a diplomatic success for the Ukrainian leader anyway, but maybe many people expected it to result just in exchange of press statements or in some form of less official statement afterwards. But what we see is a separate document where certain developments of the relationship has been fixed as of now, and certain ways of further promotion of the relations has been declared as well. For example, this very first or second line where the statement says that the parties will be working on turning the comprehensive partnership that currently exists between India and Ukraine into strategic partnership. Like, we don't know if that's going to ever materialize, but this is the hope that the parties express, and this is the intent that the parties express, which is something to be considered for sure. And if we look at the visit in a broader context, actually we do not see any news in it, because Prime Minister Modi has been very outspoken in the fact that India stands in the middle. That India pursues this policy of multi-alignment, as you call it right now, and that India pursues its interest as a power that doesn't support any side of the conflict and that doesn't want to be engaged in the conflict, even diplomatically, and that the party that wants to be equally distanced from any political conflict involved around the Ukraine issue. And so this is exactly how Prime Minister Modi shows that he has just visited Russia and now he's visiting Ukraine. And this is a very strong message, I believe, mostly targeted actually at the global south rather than at Russia or Ukraine.
You mentioned multi-alignment, India's policy. Prime Minister reiterated that India has never been neutral. India has always been on the side of peace. But again, when you look at the joint statement that you were referring to, there is a mention there of India and Ukraine respecting territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, how does that sit from a Moscow perspective?
Well, again, this is not a new statement that we hear from New Delhi. I think this is what Prime Minister Modi has been reiterating since the conflict started. And I'm sure that this is the issue that was discussed during the official visit to Russia in early July when he met President Putin. And that was also considered a great success. And the joint statement was like very, very long, where the same things were also stated. So I think from the Russian perspective, nothing new is now added to the bucket. And so like no new perspective. Moscow doesn't see any revelation in what Prime Minister Modi said. However, what you say, like I think this is a very elegant way to stress your national interest when you say that you're not neutral, you're on the side of the peace. It's like as saying I'm on the side of the God or side of love. So this is something universally accepted as a good thing. And then it depends on how peace is defined. What is peace and how we achieve it and where is it and when. So this actually gives India a lot of freedom of action because whatever peace is achieved after all, is something India might be good with. And this is actually, I think, a very elegant and wise way of pursuing diplomacy.
Again, does Russia look at this visit, say, both to Poland and to Ukraine, which are adversaries to Russia in the current context, as a bilateral visit? You were mentioning that this is probably a larger message to the global south, from India's side, that is. But do you look at it more as a bilateral relationship? For example, Russia has relationships with Pakistan or strategic partnership with China, which India also recognizes. In that context, if you can give us your thoughts, Dr. Melnikova.
Well, to me personally, it doesn't look exactly like the Russia-Pakistan or Russia-China connection. So, like, it doesn't look as a separate bilateral move, because we all know that this is the first ever state visit made by Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine. So it cannot be seen as a one in the series, of diplomatic exchanges between the leaders of both countries. So this is something new. So this is a statement per se. It's also a wartime. So the conflict in Europe is ongoing. So the prime minister took a very difficult route to get to Ukraine. So many people contemplate that Poland was actually chosen as a first point of the visit in order to logistically be more comfortable with getting to Ukraine. And so it cannot be perceived as something regular. So I think that in Russia, it is perceived as a message, but rather as a confirmation of India's multi-alignment and also this policy of balancing between the West and the East, like global South, global North. So many terms are now in use, so you can use whatever you want. But but between the West and the East, between Asian powers and Western powers. So like Modi sends a strong signal that actually his support shouldn't be seen for granted, shouldn't be taken for granted, neither in Moscow nor in the West.
Again, when you were mentioning the visit that Prime Minister had, that's the annual summit to Moscow in the first and second weeks of July, just 6 weeks back. Now, he's reiterated again and again with President Putin publicly during the remarks about how this is not an era for war, about diplomacy and dialogue is the only way to solve situations like this. Solutions are not found on the battleground. Is that, again, how you put it earlier, just an elegant way of India maneuvering or balancing the situation?
Well, we haven't seen any peace plan from India, as we saw one from China a year ago, right? So we can't say that India is either ready or sees it fit to come up with its own peace initiative. There has been a lot of speculation that maybe Prime Minister Modi will come up with such a plan after visiting both countries, for example, during the summit, the BRICS summit in Kazan later this year in October, or maybe that will happen even later on. But I think what is remarkable is that although Indian representative was at the Geneva Summit for Peace, right, he didn't sign the final statement. And that representative was exactly the former ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Kapoor, who we all knew very well. I mean, not personally, but as a professional, and whose work we saw like very, very vividly here in Russia while he was an ambassador. And I think that this is very telling, because as a person who spent several years in Moscow, being like very, very strongly integrated into the tapestry of political life here, he knows what solution will not be fit for Moscow and what solution will never be accepted in Moscow. And again, coming back to what you said about Prime Minister's words that this is not a time for war and this is not time to negotiate, to resolve conflicts in any way other than in a diplomatic way. Here in Russia, we do not see any readiness of the other side to go for negotiations. Like after the visit, we had Kursk, for example. We had which was a shock both to the nation and I think to regular people who were there. And after Kursk, the sentiment is that it's not Russia who should be showing willingness these days, right, to come back to the negotiation table. So I think that any mediation examples in China or India will be welcome in Moscow, especially given the good and the personal ties between the leaders. but we haven't seen any of those from India so far. So maybe neutrality is the piece. Well, like that version of neutrality is the policy that India sees fitter for itself as of now.
You've raised many points. I'll get to them a little later, but I just wanted to get the perspective from Moscow on India-Russia ties in terms of energy, oil, gas, etc. And in July, we've seen the latest figures which show that India has leapfrogged even China to have the maximum imports of oil from Russia. Now, both Ukraine and the West and all its allies have always been pressing India to reduce those imports. President Zelensky going on to tell Indian journalists during this visit that the Ukrainian perspective is clear, that ideally in their case, or from their perspective, there should be no engagement in terms of money being given to Russia to fuel the war from the Ukrainian perspective or the West perspective. How does Russia see this partnership between India as the largest importer of Russian energy?
Well, definitely in a different way. So I think that the trade
So does
turnout.
India, for that matter.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice to hear that. Well, the trade turnout increase has been remarkable, right? So the targets that both leaders are setting are higher and higher every year. So now I believe that it was fixed in the joint statement that the new target is $100,000 billion, right, for both nations. Yeah. So. Oil revenues is a great success, and like an opportunity to sell energy sources to India instead of Western markets, as well as to China, to sell more to China, is a good opportunity for Russia. However, as far as the discourse among the experts is concerned, Russia and India should be looking for new venues to go beyond energy sources and also military cooperation. I'm sure you know that Russia has been for many years since the Soviet times one of the main exporters of weaponry to India. So, and this remains. And these are the two pillars of a very strong strategic and hard infrastructural pillars of bilateral trade. But I think Russia and India, it's time for Russia and India to go beyond that and explore other areas, including industrial cooperation, including innovative sectors, and also the pharmaceuticals or the agricultural sector. So all those areas which are very close to both countries, but where both countries can benefit from exchange and from closer cooperation. Because you cannot sustain, and I think Russia understands it very well, you cannot sustain the trade increase only by relying on energy. And this is the same thing happening to Russia-China trade. And that was the case for Russia-Europe trade for many years. And diversification should be the next step for sure, if Russia and India want to both sustain their relationship and to keep it pragmatic.
Understood. When we look at Russia-China and India-China, it's very evident that India-China relationships are at the lowest in decades. There's been clashes on the border. We've seen Chinese aggression. Yet Russia has separate strategic partnerships with both countries. Is there any chance in the future that Russia would have to choose between those two strategic partners if situation between India and China deteriorates further?
I'll try to be direct. Well, Russia doesn't want to choose, right? So, like, Russia has long been trying to establish this triangular format of Russia, India, China dialogue, not cooperation, of course, but at least dialogue. But this effort has not always been fruitful. So, like, Foreign Minister Primakov, that was his core foreign policy concept of Russia's pivot to the east, and also of Russia, India, China triangle in Asia, because the three great powers were forcing by him to move forward with trying to structure the Eurasian space. Well, I think that these days Russia, well, after maybe the conflict in Europe is over, Russia will continue this effort, because both China and India are very important partners. And also, as more as Russia is turning inward, like to the continent, to Eurasia, it's very important for Russia to have this region in peace. Like we saw President Putin declaring this Eurasian security architecture concept in May or like in spring, like when he said that we have to think about how to best organize the security space in Eurasia, since the European security architecture failed to maintain peace like very shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so both India and Russia and China, all the three are the key pillars for that security architecture. If you ask like how this can be done, like how Russia sees this can be done, I would say that a lot of hope is now placed on the multilateral forums such as BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where all the three nations are present. China is now presiding over the SCO, so probably they will be pushing their agenda, which is natural, but more Indian engagement into the organization, I think, would be welcome, because Prime Minister skipped the latest summit. On the one hand, it was pretty logical since he was in Russia like a couple of days after, so maybe that was another opportunity to discuss the same issues but without other people. Well, however, I would say that maybe Russia would welcome more Indian engagement into those both fora, BRICS and the SCO.
Let me use a word that you used earlier in this discussion to describe India's foreign policy, and your answer, elegant way of describing it, Julia. But if I want to go a little bit further in terms of a lot of conversation apparently in Kiev between the two leaders and the delegations was about the war. What is the latest from Russia's point of view, both in terms of Kursk and the Donetsk fronts?
Well, actually, here I probably won't be as useful because I'm not much of a military expert.
Okay.
So, like, I do not follow the events on the battleground because I do not understand much in military strategy. So, maybe we shall skip this one.
Understood. Fair enough point. Again, the fears of this war escalating in terms of the nuclear point of view, whether it's Zaporozhye, whether it's the Kursk nuclear plant, both sides have been accusing each other of possibly targeting nuclear plants. There have been reports of fears of tactical nuclear weapons being used. What's the perspective again from Moscow?
Also, the official position has been that Russia wants to avoid turning this conflict into nuclear in any way possible, because that cause of events will be destructive. And I know that there has been an expert debate whether nuclear weapons should be used in at least a limited territory, both in Russia and in the West. Like the war reports, some major American think tanks consider the opportunity. European think tanks did it as well, and individual Russian experts also came up with such conversations. But I don't see it as any more than verbal escalation in a way. So, look, verbal escalation is also escalation, actually. So it's kind of a signal, or it can be perceived as a signal depending on who says it. So this is something that we all have to understand. But as of now, I don't see it going any further beyond rhetoric from the Russian side.
Again, you understood. You would be talking earlier about peace plans, and there are several on the table. You mentioned India had not come up with one, but from what we can gather on Indian foreign policy, I think India doesn't want to put its own plan. It wants to help either side, both sides get together. But there's the Chinese proposal, there's the Ukrainian proposal, of course, there's a Chinese proposal. I think that the Turks also tried something. And then there's that Peace for Summit, which apparently will have a second meeting before the US elections in November. But how does Russia see India? Because India, from the best of my knowledge, doesn't look at itself as a mediator. But since, say, Prime Minister Modi is one of the few leaders, if not the only ones, apart from maybe Hungary, Turkey, and some other countries who visited both countries and met both leaders, what would Russia be looking at India doing? Just passing messages between the two sides, facilitating something?
Well, that's of course now the speculation for us, as a matter of speculation. But I saw it on Bloomberg yesterday that, to
Yeah.
their knowledge, Prime Minister refused to be the mediator, but he agreed, or at least said that he would consider passing on messages from one leader to another, or just at least sharing what they say to one another. We don't know if that move was discussed with President Putin either earlier, or it will be maybe during one of the telephone conversations that the leaders are sure to have before they meet in person in October. So probably what you're saying is right. So Prime Minister Modi wants to stay away from producing the peace plan and is ready to just be there, right? Use the trust that he has established, or at least some form of trust with both leaders, in order to just be there and maybe put in a word when it's needed. I think that for Russia, it's maybe this is not something that Moscow would prefer having, not the strongest show of support. However, one thing is rhetoric, another thing is practice. And what we see in practice, that the joint statement in Moscow was filled with particular projects and was full of new ideas of cooperation in all sectors. So maybe for Russia, it is actually best that Prime Minister abstains from marking either himself or Indian foreign policy as doing this or that with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, but just for India to remain pragmatic with the relationship with both countries. I think that during the conflict time, sometimes not to say is better than to say, but this is my personal take. This is not the Russian foreign policy take, probably, but my personal take is when they don't cause you to speak, maybe you actually shouldn't. And you should just continue doing your business, and you just continue being pragmatic, and you just continue pursuing your interest where you see it possible. And Russia and India definitely do share lots of points of interest, both economically and people to people. And there are many areas to work at, be it in the Arctic, the Far East, the oil thing, the food security issue. So maybe that would be best to just continue working on that, without talking a lot.
One of the areas you talked about earlier also between India and Russia is defense cooperation. And we've seen how it's evolved from, say, the Soviet times to current Russian Federation times, and how it's reducing in terms of defense expenditure or defense deals. The S-400 still has to be closed out. There are other deals on the table. The Ukrainians possibly looking at, our ships need their engines, the helicopters were also made there. In Poland, there were some reports of maybe the T-72 tanks provided by Russia and Soviet Union before that could be refurbished by Poland. India is diversifying with the US, France, Israel, and other countries as well on the defense front. So even while the Russian naval chief was in India over the last few days, India's defense minister is currently in Washington meeting top leaders, including their defense secretary and the national security advisor. How does Russia see all of that fitting in terms of India diversifying and reducing its dependency on Russian defense exports from your side?
Mm-hmm. Also, on the one hand, the strategy is clear, because during as part of our work at the Russian International Affairs Council, we organized some events dedicated to the topic. And what I heard from military experts is that since a lot of Russian weaponry is now occupied at the Western Front, India sees it as a potential shortage issue. Right? What if Russia wastes all its weaponry, say, right, in the simple words, in the West, and then India wants to buy more and there is nothing more to buy. So this is a concern for Indian defense complex, and this is the reason why India wants to diversify more. But this is one aspect to the problem. Another aspect to the problem is that India, and as I have heard, it's already quite an issue, although maybe not in a strategic way, but some parts of Indian weaponry happen to be at the front in the West, in Ukraine, happen to be used by Ukrainian army. And this is maybe not the direct sales thing, But this is how the weapon market works. So like you sell something to somebody, and then this weaponry appears somewhere else. And this is actually already a concern for the Russian military and for the Russian military experts as well, because if you do not control where the weaponry goes, and then if, like, let's imagine we see that Indian weaponry was used to create some damage, or like to shoot people, Russian soldiers at the Western Front, then this can be an issue. And I think that this is a subject of a very delicate a negotiation between the military. Military to military negotiation between Russia and India, and I think that this is something that has to be very closely watched as of now, because this is an very unfortunate. This could be a very unfortunate development of events in the defense sector.
Interesting point you're bringing up there. Again, I'm going to ask for the Russian perspective on India getting closer to the West, to the US. I mean, I outlined meetings that are currently on or have just finished in Washington between the two sides. There's also the Quad, where, again, naval exercises will take place soon.
Yeah, so I think India, the US is like more or less as Russia, China for India, but for Russia. So this is a very mirror image kind of perception of how different powers try to balance. Again, so like turning back to one of the previous questions we discussed, what is said and what is done, and whether it's very important to strive for verbal confirmation of support and of friendship, or this is where the parties have to look at what's going on in practice and like how the partnership is actually developing. Like Russia has known about India-Western ties for a long time. Like it's been developing not for 2 years, but like for decades. And so India has been trying to balance actually since the time of the Cold War. And again, where the red line is probably military to military cooperation if it goes beyond Moscow's expectations. But again, given the delicate strategy of Prime Minister Modi, I don't think that this is the issue that hasn't been raised at the table with President Putin. So this is probably
Dr. Julia Melnikova, again, I thank you so much for giving us your. Do you want to add something?
No, sorry. I think I'm losing my voice for some reason.
Okay, so that's a good note to end this conversation. Again, thanking you for your time and sharing your experiences and expertise as well as perspective from Moscow. Absolutely appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours. And to our viewers, do send us feedback on this interview. You can follow all our social media handles for the latest that we put up on our website, that is articles or interviews like this with Dr. Julia Melnikova on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.